In this video, I want to talk about Cesar Chavez. I grew up in California, so I knew who Cesar Chavez was, but I didn't really understand much about the resistance movement that he inspired and then kind of torpedoed. I'm looking at this book by Miriam Powell called The Union of Their Dreams, Power, Hope, and Struggle in Cesar Chavez's Farm Worker Movement. On one hand, this book made me realize that I am probably never going to be a union activist. It's very ruthless and focused on the practical tactics, ends justify the means type of approach. But that said, it focuses on the people who had no experience coming in, and so it really gives you a picture of how do people actually become activists. So let's set the scene for the situation in the mid-60s when Cesar Chavez comes onto the scene. You have a lot of Mexican workers who are either living in America or still living in Mexico, and then through the season they will go up further and further north in California to follow the crops and follow the different farms. So they'll probably work on lots of different farms, each one for just a couple weeks, and all kinds of different produce. You had lettuce, you had grapes, you had a whole bunch of different things. What are tips that we can learn through the small things that we're doing? I present 4 tips from Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement. The first tip is find mentors. So we can take this a couple different ways. For one, the Mexican workers were kind of inspired by Filipino workers who had done a successful strike. They were a lot more organized than the Mexicans, and in early 1965 they successfully had a strike. So another way to think about finding mentors is that Chavez had his own mentor. Before he started the union effort and project, he had been led by a guy in the Community Service Organization, CSO, and he had kind of learned some basics there of doing some organizing, and eventually became frustrated with the organization because they seemed a little bit too middle class. They wouldn't work with the farm workers, and that was Cesar Chavez's passion and the thing that he was really excited about doing. One of Cesar Chavez's other mentors was Gandhi, who practiced nonviolent fasts. Cesar Chavez goes on not really a hunger strike because he felt like that was coercive, but he would say, this is a fast for my purity and for the purity of the movement. He would go on these pilgrimages. It was a little bit frustrating to the people who were the volunteers, who were kind of doing the rallying, doing the organizing, because he wouldn't delegate very much authority, and so anytime they tried to make a decision, they would have to reach him while he was fasting or while he's marching through the desert, which was really difficult for them to do. When I think about finding mentors myself, I'm a little unsure what kind of resistance to find a mentor in. Second tip, get church folks on board. So this is an interesting tip because you would expect, since a lot of Mexicans are Catholic, that religious support would come from the Catholic institution. Well, when Cesar Chavez was getting going, they didn't have the support of the Catholic Church. Surprisingly, they did have the support of particularly one person. His name was Chris Hartmeyer. He was a white dude, a Presbyterian minister, and had met Chavez and kind of followed him for the next 20 plus years. He floated in and out and had all kinds of different official affiliations with him. So at the beginning, what he would do is he was the point person for the other religious people. So Cesar Chavez would organize a strike, and Chris would be the one who would explain it to all the white people and explain why it was their duty to support the poor people who were going on strike. Took a lot of flack in the first strike that they did for being so outspoken and so willing to be political. There was another way, though, that getting church folk on board was really valuable, and that was that they would strategically use the church people as part of their protests. So let me give you an example. One time they had been ordered legally not to shout into the fields, and their main shout was huelga, which is strike. My Spanish pronunciation is not very good. And so there they were shouting, and they had been told that they weren't allowed to do that. So Chris and some of the other ministers who he rallied together shouted, "Huelga, huelga, strike, strike," and got arrested. Cesar Chavez timed it so that he was giving a speech right when he could announce that these peaceful Presbyterian ministers had just been arrested for disturbing the peace. Religion is so often used as a tool, but here it seems like the religious people are being used to kind of embody innocence and to show the illegal or unjust methods that the police or that the state are using. They were willing to sacrifice the way Cesar Chavez was looking for. Because of their position, they were able to really help the movement. Third tip, grieve when you actually accomplish your goals. So this is kind of a complex one. Let's give a little bit of the story. The first strike was very successful. What they ended up being able to do was, instead of just a strike, they took it to the boycott level, where they encouraged people to not buy grapes unless they had the union seal on them. And so that ended up being kind of a recurrent strategy, one of their go-tos. The first layer of defense was strikes, then the next layer was boycotts. And what they would end up doing is they wouldn't just boycott the certain product, which would be to individual consumers, but they would actually do what was called a secondary boycott. And that was when you boycotted a store if it sold that product. So you would boycott the whole set of grocery stores if they sold the wrong kind of grapes. And so then that was a really effective way, because if you could get people to boycott the stores, then it put a ton of pressure on the store owners. So they didn't really have to care about the cause. And so that was their main approach. And they kind of had a special legal loophole where that was allowed, because usually that kind of boycott of the store for carrying something that you didn't like was illegal, but in this case, they kind of got around it effectively. So you had the strike, you had the boycott, and then you also had legal pressure, because they hired this maverick legal guy who would just kind of throw stuff out there and kind of learn on the job, figure it out as he went, kind of try some crazy, innovative legal tactics. So this is late 60s. What are they going for? They're going for union recognition. What the growers did was they said, oh, well, sure, you can have a union, but it'll be the union that we really like, that kind of was a lukewarm type of union. It would do just enough for workers that they weren't totally discontent, but then it would really not push on the growers too much. So the growers really liked this rival union. It was the Teamsters, and the Teamsters were known to be in the... So Cesar Chavez had a big pitch to the farm workers, which was, you want more than wages, you want dignity, you want respect for your work, you want someone who really understands and represents you, you want empowerment. And so that was the pitch to the farm workers, and gradually they managed to turn them over. So what happened was, as they gradually gained more support, they had more ties to the more established unions. And so they were a little bit worried that if they were going to get help from the more established unions, then they would have to give up the boycott, which was their favorite tactic, their favorite tool. And so instead what they did was they said, no, sure, we're willing to have a law, but we're going to propose the craziest law that we can think of, the one that gives us the most benefits and most power. And what happened was it basically accidentally passed. So the reason you need to grieve when you actually accomplish your goals is because this law actually ended up being kind of the peak of the union. They didn't really know what to push for beyond that. And the problem with actually getting their goal was then they didn't have the same devotion and commitment and sacrifice that they did in the early days. And so a lot of the people who were part of the union were part of the union so that they could get paid more. And that created a really contrast and kind of a contradiction, where they were fighting for farm workers to get paid a lot and to have a lot of power. But what they wanted from people part of the movement, not just the union, was for people to be willing to sacrifice and to live in a poor lifestyle and to show their devotion to the cause. So Cesar Chavez was always then, after this law passed, creating new goals and kind of shooting himself in the foot. He would sabotage certain things, he would be kind of unreasonable in the negotiating, And yeah. In terms of myself, it's hard to say. The resistance movement I feel most strong about is kind of a very vague one that is resistance to our current political teardown. Fourth tip, I don't really know how to put it, don't falsely accuse people. So after the law was passed in California, it was kind of downhill for the farm workers movement. And honestly, that was largely because of Cesar Chavez being unwilling to face the fears that he had. He really was afraid of not being in charge. And this plays out in a bunch of different ways. One way is he has said from the beginning that this is a movement for farm workers, and one of his main guys, LSAO, really buys into that and is just super loyal. But LSAO realizes that the farm workers who are leading each individual farm are the ones who should be trained up into the union. And Cesar Chavez keeps kind of tamping that down and looking for excuses about why they shouldn't really be the ones who are being raised up. Instead, Cesar Chavez builds this whole headquarters that's in a really remote place, and most of the people who work there are not actually farm workers. So there's kind of a class divide. So one of the ways that Cesar Chavez became a little bit power hungry was anytime he perceived a threat, he would make up a reason why that person was actually kind of a traitor or against him, and he would kick them out of the organization. And this went on for lots of people, many different times. At one point, there were so many people who were being kicked out that all the religious people and the partner organizations talked to Chris and they said, "What's going on here? This looks really bad." And Chris kind of defended it and would say, "Oh, well, we're always going to make some mistakes. It's better to be vigilant than to just let things go by." And that was kind of good enough for the partner organizations. Things escalate at one point so far that people are pretty sure Cesar Chavez had arranged with a really shady cousin that he had to kill one of the main volunteers. And so Cesar Chavez is really out of control here. And what some of the highest ranking, longest standing volunteers do is they decide that they're going to form a rival slate of officers for the union organization. And Chavez manages to fire them all. And so what they do is they take it to court, and it's a long back and forth. It's really messy when they're in this legal battle, and all of the people who are really skilled are now using all of their organizing tactics back against Chavez. In fact, they even do a fast as part of their effort. So don't falsely accuse people. I mean, I would say kind of broader, try not to go off the rails, don't be power hungry. There's a lot of different ways to put it, but don't falsely accuse people seems like a safe tip to get from this. This is the saddest part of the farm workers movement. I think it's something more to keep in mind as I'm on the outside looking in at other organizations. I think it's easy to expect them to do things perfectly, and reminding myself that here you have these stories of these really effective movements at certain points is a good reminder that just because a movement is really effective at one place doesn't make that the way that it's always going to be, or doesn't mean that even at that really good spot, it's doing everything right. By the time that Cesar Chavez dies at age 66, the United Farm Workers movement is dwindling. They're really cashing in on Cesar Chavez's image. They even trademarked the phrase "Si se puede." Yes, we can do it. It can be done. So by that point, it's kind of a return. They are now the Teamsters, the union that represents the establishment. Overall, I want to thank the people who protested and organized and sacrificed to represent the farm workers and to represent the poor and the immigrant. May justice come for all.